So the UCAT is probably unlike any test that you've ever sat before, and it can be really overwhelming to even start preparing. But today I'll be sharing with you everything that you need to know to do well on this test, including my 7-step preparation process that will help you do as well as you possibly can. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the YouTube channel. If you don't know me, my name is Emil, and I'm a first-year medical student studying at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. And I did the UCAT in 2020 and I scored in the 99th percentile. So in this video, I'll share with you everything you need to know for the test, including the structure of the test, what makes it difficult, when you should actually start preparing, and then finally what I would actually do if I was preparing for the UCAT starting fresh today. So let's start off with an overview of the test. So the UCAT is a computer-based 2-hour-long multiple choice test with 5 separate subtests. These subtests test a range of cognitive abilities, which can include things like reading comprehension to mathematical reasoning to pattern recognition. Something you should know straight away when starting the UCAT is that each of these subtests are actually timed separately, which means that you have 21 minutes to finish the first subtest and 31 minutes to finish the second subtest. But even if you finish the first subtest with 5 minutes remaining, for example, that doesn't mean you can carry over that 5 minutes for the next subtest, because you'll always only have 31 minutes to complete the second subtest. I'll now give a quick summary of each of the subtests in the UCAT, and the first one is verbal reasoning, or the VR subtest. So this is essentially your English subtest. You'll be given a series of long passages with questions attached to them, and you'll be required to draw information out of the passage to answer each of the questions. In this subtest, you have 44 questions to answer in 21 minutes, which gives you approximately 29 seconds per question. The second subtest in the UCAT is the decision making, or DM subtest. This subtest is essentially the one that tests your ability to critically think and problem solve. There is a big variety in the types of questions that you actually can come across, but they can range from things like probability questions to Venn diagrams to logic puzzles. In this subtest, you have 29 questions to answer in 31 minutes, which gives you approximately 64 seconds to answer each question. The next subtest in the UCAT is the quantitative reasoning, or QR subtest, which is essentially your maths subtest. In this subtest, you're often given charts, tables, and schedules to read and take calculations from, or you'll be asked to do simple calculations like area questions, distance, speed, time questions, or budgeting questions. In this subtest, you have 36 questions to answer in 24 minutes, which gives you approximately 40 seconds per question. The fourth subtest in the UCAT is your abstract reasoning subtest, which is essentially your pattern recognition subtest. This subtest requires you to look at a set of shapes and either decide whether a certain answer box goes into either set, or sometimes you'll be asked to find the next pattern that logically follows from a series. This subtest is one of the most time pressured in the UCAT because you have 55 questions to answer in 13 minutes, which gives you approximately 14 seconds per question. The final subtest in the UCAT is your situational judgment subtest, or your SJT subtest, which is the one that tests basically all of your ethical skills. In this subtest, you'll be given scenarios with questions that require you to decide whether certain actions or thoughts are appropriate or inappropriate, or important or not important to consider. In this subtest, you have about 69 questions to answer in 26 minutes, which gives you about 22 seconds to answer each question. So the first 4 of these subtests will be added up to make your cognitive score, which is the score that most people will tell you and is the score that most universities actually look at. The last subtest, the situational judgment one, is often given a separate score or a banding depending on what quartile of test takers that you were ranked in. Most universities don't actually look at the situational judgment subtest that much, but it's still important to prepare for it in case they actually use it or in case they change their mind. Okay, so now let's actually talk about what makes the UCAT difficult, because I think this is a good place to start to understand how you can prepare. The first thing that you might have realized makes the UCAT very, very difficult is the timing. For the majority of questions in the UCAT, you have less than half a minute to answer them, and this would be fine if the questions were of an easy difficulty, but the issue in the UCAT is that sometimes some questions require even the smartest of people 2 minutes or more to answer them, and as a result, this is why things like skipping and guessing are really, really common in the UCAT. This leads me on into another thing that makes the UCAT really difficult, which is that it's completely different from any other test that you might have done in the past. For a lot of your tests at school, they require perfectionism, going through the questions in order and showing you're working. But in the UCAT, doing these things can actually slow you down a lot and can hinder your progress. As a result, a lot of people find it really, really difficult to actually switch their mentality from their school test taking attitude to the test taking attitude that's that's required in the UCAT. On top of all of this, another thing that makes the UCAT so difficult is the mental strain that it actually puts on you. Because the timings are so short on the UCAT and the questions are so difficult, a lot of people actually struggle to have the mental fitness to actually make it to the end of the test. For a lot of people, by the time they reach the end of the second or third subtest, they lose a lot of their concentration and then they end up dropping a lot of marks because they can't focus on the questions. So now that I've completely freaked you out by telling you about how hard the UCAT actually is, you might actually be wondering when you should start preparing for the test. So this will definitely change from person to person depending on how good you are at cognitive tests and also how good you want to do on the UCAT. In general though, if you're someone who's naturally good at cognitive tests, or if you're someone who doesn't necessarily need to do super well on the UCAT, then you can get away with preparing for a month or even less. However, if you're someone who wants to do really well on the UCAT, or if you're just in general not that good at cognitive tests, then I really recommend spending anywhere between 4 to 6 months preparing for your UCAT. I personally was planning on doing my test in July and I ended up starting preparing in January or February. Obviously this will change from person to person, but in general, the more preparation you do, the closer you'll actually be to achieving your potential on the UCAT. Okay, so now let's get into the 7 steps that I would take if I was starting fresh to prepare for the UCAT today. The first thing that I would do would be to get a general idea of the style of questions in the UCAT. So this video is definitely a great place to start, but I also recommend checking out my other videos where I do questions live, or just going on the UCAT Consortium's official website yourself and getting an idea of the type of questions on the test so that you get an idea of what it is that you're dealing with. The second step that I would take would be to buy a UCAT question bank of any type and start learning the technique required to answer the questions on the UCAT. Once I'd gotten a question bank, I'd start with the verbal reasoning subtest and I'd start by learning the proper way and method of answering questions. Once you get started on these question banks, you'll quickly discover that there are efficient and non-efficient ways to answer the questions, and what I would do is I would write some notes on the most efficient ways to answer the questions in each of the subtests. They aren't sponsoring this video in any way, but if you were wondering what a good question bank to buy might be, I do have a 15% discount with MedEntry's question bank, so if you'd like, do check that out in the description box below. So once I had done this step of learning the method of answering these questions, I'd actually move on to doing some untimed questions in that subtest. For example, in the verbal reasoning subtest, I might have learnt from the question bank the method of scanning for keywords. And then what I would do is I would go through some verbal reasoning questions untimed using the scanning for keywords method to try and get the correct answer. At this stage, I'd be going for 100% accuracy rather than speed or anything else. The reason I say you should focus on your fundamentals first is that when you actually end up finally doing timed practice, this will mean that you're more ready for the challenge and that you'll also be less likely to default into making bad habits when you do timed practice. So at the end of this stage, I'll hopefully know the general methods of answering questions in the verbal reasoning subtest, and I'll also have hopefully had some untimed practice applying these concepts. The next step that I would take would be to repeat this process for all of the other subtests so that I finally get to a level of competency on the UCAT with untimed questions. During the process of learning the technique for the other subtests, I'd also make sure to interweave some verbal reasoning practice so that I didn't forget what I had already learned. Now, once I had finished this step and I was decently good at all of the subtests, this is when I would start to move on to doing some timed practice. What I would start by doing is doing some timed subtest mocks for each of the subtests so that I get an idea of how the timing actually affects the way that I answer questions. In this step, I'd make sure to try and learn the strategies that are required to do well under time pressure. So I'd be learning things like what questions you want to skip in each subtest, what questions you flag and guess, and how you deal with the time pressure in general. It's important that you do this in this stage because putting in the time pressure really changes the way you're actually able to answer questions in the UCAT. Now, the next step that follows on from doing timed subtest mocks is to finally do a timed full exam. Now, hopefully at this stage, it actually won't be that daunting to do a practice exam because you will have been going through your preparation in careful steps. As a result, when you do your first exam at this stage, you'll probably be actually pretty decent at the test. You'll hopefully be at a level that you can improve from going forward into the other practice tests that you do. Now, the last step of my preparation process is actually probably one of the more important ones, which is that I would review all of the exams and subtest mocks that I was doing. Reviewing is actually a really important part of improving in the UCAT because otherwise it's too easy to fall into the trap of just doing practice questions and again and again. What I'd be doing is I'd be going through my past mocks and my past subtest mocks and checking which questions I was getting wrong, which subtest I was doing well on, how my timings looked like for each of the subtests, and which question types I was actually spending more time on. Using this information, you can actually be empowered to target your revision to the question types that you struggle with or the subtests that you struggle with, and as a result, this is how you actually get strong improvement in the UCAT. Using this 7-step process, you'll actually be able to ease yourself into smashing the UCAT because you'll go through your preparation in organized stages. If you want to hear more from me about how you can smash the UCAT, check out this playlist and make sure to subscribe to the channel.